Prisons are designed to separate danger from society. Steel doors, barbed wire, watchtowers, uniforms meant to represent control and order. But over the last 2 decades, investigations across the United States and Europe have revealed a disturbing truth. Some of the most serious crimes inside jails were not committed by inmates, but by the guards themselves. From Baltimore to New York, from London to Romania, officers sworn to protect the system were caught smuggling drugs, coordinating violence, falsifying reports, and covering up abuse. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns, and they thrived in places where oversight was weak, silence was enforced, and power went unquestioned. This is the hidden side of prison authority, where corruption didn't break the system. It used it. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Baltimore, when guards ran the yard. Baltimore's jail system had been under pressure for years. Overcrowding, understaffing, and aging infrastructure were already public concerns. But what federal investigators uncovered went far beyond administrative failure. Inside the Baltimore City Detention Center, authority itself had been compromised. The investigation began quietly. Federal agents noticed unusual patterns. Drugs entering the facility at levels inconsistent with inmate-only smuggling, coordinated inmate behavior that suggested inside facilitation, and repeated incidents where surveillance footage or incident reports didn't align. At first, these appeared as anomalies. Over time, they formed a pattern. Correctional officers were at the center of it. Multiple guards were found to be actively smuggling heroin, marijuana, tobacco, and cell phones into the jail. These are not small favors. Officers used their uniforms, access points, and shift privileges to bypass security protocols. In return, they received cash payments, protection from inmate gangs, and in some cases, direct involvement in criminal profits. The most disturbing element was the relationship between guards and organized inmate groups. Officers didn't just deliver contraband, they coordinated with inmates. Doors were unlocked at specific times. Searches were intentionally delayed. Certain inmates were moved or protected while others were exposed to violence. When assaults occurred, reports were manipulated. Injuries were downplayed or attributed to fights between inmates. Medical visits were delayed. Surveillance footage went missing or was never reviewed. The paper trail was carefully managed. One former officer later testified that refusing to participate came with consequences. New guards were pressured to conform. Those who questioned orders were assigned to dangerous posts, isolated from peers, or labeled unreliable. Silence became a survival strategy. Supervisors were not always directly involved, but many ignored warning signs. Complaints from inmates were dismissed as routine. Internal reports were accepted without scrutiny. The assumption was simple. Guards were trustworthy, inmates were not. Federal prosecutors eventually dismantled the operation. More than a dozen officers were charged. Several pleaded guilty to racketeering, drug trafficking, and conspiracy. Court records detailed how deeply embedded the corruption had become. What shocked investigators most was how ordinary it all felt inside the jail. Corruption didn't operate in chaos. It functioned through schedules, routines, and familiarity. The same officers worked the same units. Trust replaced oversight. Authority replaced accountability. The Baltimore case exposed a structural vulnerability. Guards controlled access to cells, movement, information, and security systems. That control made them gatekeepers. And when gatekeepers turned criminal, the entire system bent around them. Reforms followed. Leadership changes were announced. Oversight measures were promised. But the damage extended beyond policy. Inmates who had been abused or exploited were left with little recourse. Trust in the institution collapsed. Baltimore wasn't an exception. It was an early warning. The lesson was clear. When those entrusted with control are left unchecked, prisons don't just fail, they become tools for crime. New York, violence hidden in paperwork. In New York, corruption inside jails didn't always rely on smuggling or gang alliances. Instead, it hid in something far more ordinary: paperwork. Incident reports, use of force logs, medical notes, and internal reviews became the primary tools used to conceal abuse rather than expose it. For years, complaints from inmates at facilities like Rikers Island followed the same pattern. Prisoners reported being assaulted during routine procedures, cell extractions, searches, transfers, or disciplinary lockdowns. Many described being punched, kicked, or slammed into walls after they were already restrained. Yet official reports consistently told a different story. According to documentation written by officers, injuries were the result of inmate resistance, accidental falls, or necessary force. The language was standardized, vague, repetitive, and almost always favorable to staff. The contradiction became impossible to ignore when medical records began telling a different story. Doctors noted broken bones, head trauma, internal injuries, and patterns of bruising inconsistent with the explanations provided. Some injuries occurred in areas unlikely to be harmed during standard restraint procedures. Others suggested repeated blows rather than a single incident. Surveillance footage was supposed to clarify the truth. Instead, it often deepened suspicion. Cameras were pointed away from critical areas. Footage was missing during key moments. In some cases, cameras inexplicably stopped recording just before use of force incidents occurred. When video did exist, it sometimes directly contradicted written reports. Inmates described as aggressive appeared compliant. Officers claimed restraint techniques were followed, but footage showed excessive force. These inconsistencies triggered internal reviews and, eventually, federal scrutiny. Investigators discovered that after violent incidents, officers often collaborated on their reports. Statements were written to match each other closely. Language was coordinated. Timelines aligned too perfectly. Any officer who deviated from the agreed narrative risked exposing the entire group. This coordination wasn't accidental. Former guards later testified that there was an unspoken rule: protect each other first. Writing a truthful report that implicated a colleague was seen as betrayal. Officers who broke this rule found themselves isolated, reassigned, or labeled unreliable. Supervisors played a key role. Many approved reports without reviewing video evidence. Others ignored red flags to avoid conflict or scrutiny. Internal affairs units were overwhelmed, understaffed, or discouraged from pursuing aggressive investigations. Inmate complaints rarely went anywhere. Prisoners were often told their claims lacked credibility. Some were transferred shortly after filing grievances. Others faced retaliation disguised as disciplinary action, loss of privileges, harsher housing assignments, or increased scrutiny. Federal investigators later described a culture where violence was normalized and justified through documentation. Force wasn't always spontaneous or defensive. In some cases, it was punitive. Officers used violence to assert control, then relied on paperwork to erase it. One major investigation uncovered multiple incidents where inmates were beaten during planned extractions. Teams entered cells knowing force would be used. Afterwards, officers claimed the inmates initiated the confrontation. Medical staff were pressured to delay documentation. Reports were filed quickly to establish the official version before evidence could surface. The consequences eventually reached the courts. Several officers were charged with civil rights violations, falsifying records, and conspiracy. The city faced massive lawsuits, costing taxpayers millions. Federal oversight was imposed to monitor use of force practices and reporting accuracy. But the damage went beyond legal penalties. Trust inside the system collapsed. Inmates learned that reporting abuse could make things worse. Guards learned that paperwork could protect them until it couldn't. What made New York's case particularly disturbing was how bureaucratic the abuse became. There were no secret tunnels or hidden deals, just forms, check boxes, signatures, authority expressed through ink rather than overt criminal networks. Violence didn't need to be hidden physically. It was hidden administratively. Investigators concluded that the problem wasn't a handful of violent officers. It was a system that rewarded compliance over truth. where loyalty to colleagues mattered more than accountability, where documentation served power instead of justice. New York's jail system became a case study in how institutions can fail without collapsing. Everything continued to function. Shifts were filled, reports were filed, procedures were followed, while abuse persisted beneath the surface. The lesson was stark. When oversight depends on self-reporting, and when authority controls the narrative, violence doesn't disappear. It gets written out of existence. London, silence is policy. In the United Kingdom, corruption inside prisons rarely resembled organized smuggling rings or open brutality captured on leaked footage. Instead, it operated through something quieter and far more difficult to expose: institutional silence. Investigations into several English prisons revealed that abuse persisted not because it was unseen, but because it was deliberately unchallenged. British prisons operate under a framework that emphasizes professionalism, restraint, and procedural discipline. On paper, the system appears robust. Officers are trained in de-escalation. Use of force guidelines are strict. Independent monitoring boards exist to oversee conditions. Yet multiple inquiries found that these safeguards often failed in practice. Complaints from inmates followed a familiar trajectory. Allegations of excessive force, verbal abuse, or improper restraint were logged, reviewed internally, and dismissed. The reasoning was predictable: lack of evidence, conflicting accounts, or reliance on staff testimony over prisoner statements. In many cases, no meaningful investigation occurred. One of the most significant revelations came from inquiries into restraint-related deaths. In several documented cases, inmates died following physical restraint by guards. Initial reports attributed the deaths to medical complications or sudden illness. It was only after independent reviews and public pressure that deeper investigations revealed prolonged restraint, delayed medical response, and violations of protocol. Officers involved in these incidents often provided nearly identical statements. Timelines matched too closely. Language was repeated verbatim across reports. This uniformity raised immediate concerns among investigators, who suspected coordination rather than coincidence. Former prison staff later confirmed what many had suspected. After serious incidents, officers were often advised, informally, to get their story straight. This wasn't always framed as a cover-up. It was presented as professional solidarity. Protecting colleagues was seen as protecting the institution itself. Those who challenged this culture paid a price. Whistleblowers described being ostracized, denied promotions, or reassigned to undesirable shifts. Some left the service entirely. Others learned to stay silent. Supervisors and management played a crucial role in maintaining this silence. While not always directly involved in abuse, they often discouraged escalation. Investigations were kept internal. External scrutiny was treated as a threat rather than a safeguard. The priority was stability, not transparency. Inspection reports by independent bodies painted a troubling picture. Oversight mechanisms existed, but their recommendations were frequently ignored or delayed. Staffing shortages and overcrowding were cited as explanations for lapses, but these factors did not account for coordinated reporting or consistent dismissal of serious allegations. In several prisons, inmates reported that filing complaints led to retaliation. This rarely took the form of overt punishment. Instead, it appeared as increased scrutiny, loss of privileges, or transfers to more restrictive units. The message was subtle but clear. Speaking out carried consequences. Video surveillance, where available, was inconsistently used. Cameras were positioned to monitor general movement rather than critical interaction points. In some cases, footage was overwritten before reviews could occur. Investigators later concluded that the system was designed more for security management than accountability. Public attention intensified after media investigations exposed patterns of abuse. Undercover reporting, leaked internal documents, and testimony from former staff forced the issue into the open. Parliamentary inquiries followed, confirming systemic failures rather than isolated misconduct. One inquiry concluded that the prison service had developed a defensive culture. Complaints were treated as reputational risks. Officers were protected by default. Inmates were viewed as unreliable narrators of their own experiences. Despite reforms and renewed training initiatives, critics argued that the underlying problem remained unresolved. Procedures could be rewritten, but culture was harder to change. Silence had become normalized, embedded into daily operations. Unlike cases involving dramatic corruption, the British system's failure was quieter. There were no high-profile smuggling rings or criminal enterprises. Instead, harm occurred through neglect, restraint misuse, and administrative indifference. The lack of accountability allowed abuse to persist without obvious scandal. What made this particularly dangerous was its invisibility. Violence didn't need to escalate to extremes to be harmful. Prolonged restraint, psychological intimidation, and denial of medical care all had lasting effects, even when they left no immediate marks. Investigators warned that systems relying on internal trust without external verification were inherently vulnerable. When authority controls information flow, oversight becomes symbolic rather than effective. The UK cases demonstrated that corruption doesn't always wear the face of crime. Sometimes it wears the face of procedure, of professionalism, of calm, controlled environments where nothing appears wrong until someone dies or evidence finally escapes the walls. Silence, in these prisons, was not a failure of communication. It was a policy in practice. Romania, brutality behind closed doors. In Romania, the exposure of prison abuse did not begin with official audits or internal reports. It began with leaked footage. Grainy, handheld videos surfaced showing inmates being beaten, humiliated, and threatened by guards inside detention facilities. What had long been rumored suddenly became undeniable. Romania's prison system had been criticized for decades by human rights organizations. Overcrowding, poor medical care, and outdated facilities were well documented. But the most serious allegations, systematic brutality by staff, remained largely hidden until visual evidence forced authorities to respond. The footage showed guards striking inmates with batons, fists, and boots. Prisoners were already restrained in some clips. Others were punished collectively for the actions of individuals. Inmates were forced to kneel, lie face down, or stand for extended periods as a form of control. The violence was not chaotic. It was routine. When investigators reviewed internal records, they found a familiar pattern. Use of force incidents were either undocumented or described in vague terms. Injuries were attributed to inmate fights or accidents. Medical attention was delayed or minimized. Complaints rarely progressed beyond initial review. Guards involved in abuse often justified their actions as discipline. In interviews, some officers described violence as necessary to maintain order in overcrowded and understaffed facilities. This reasoning was echoed by supervisors who framed brutality as a regrettable but unavoidable part of prison management. Oversight mechanisms existed in theory but failed in practice. Internal investigations were conducted by colleagues of the accused. Independent inspections were infrequent and announced in advance. Inmates who attempted to report abuse faced intimidation or retaliation. One former inmate described how complaints were discouraged. Prisoners were warned that reporting guards would lead to harsher treatment, transfers to more dangerous cells, loss of visitation rights, increased surveillance. The threat alone was often enough to ensure silence. International bodies eventually intervened. Reports from the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture confirmed widespread abuse. Their findings included excessive force, degrading treatment, and a lack of accountability at all levels of the system. The Romanian government responded with promises of reform. Training programs were announced. Policies were rewritten, but implementation was slow and prosecutions were rare. Many of the guards seen in leaked footage remained employed. What distinguished Romania's case was the normalization of violence. Abuse was not hidden behind paperwork alone. It was accepted as part of the prison environment. Guards operated with confidence that their actions would not be questioned. Investigators concluded that the problem stemmed from a combination of weak oversight, cultural acceptance of authority, and systemic neglect. Prisons operated as closed worlds. External scrutiny was minimal. Internal discipline was symbolic. The leaked footage changed the narrative, but it did not erase the underlying conditions. Without sustained monitoring and enforcement, reforms remained largely cosmetic. Romania's prisons became an example of what happens when power operates entirely in the dark, where institutions exist without transparency, where authority answers only to itself. The lesson echoed those from the United States and the United Kingdom. Different systems, different laws, same outcome. When oversight fails, brutality fills the gap. The pattern: power without oversight. Across different countries, prison systems vary in structure, funding, and law. Yet the cases from Baltimore, New York, London, and Romania all reveal the same underlying pattern. When authority operates without meaningful oversight, abuse does not appear as an anomaly. It becomes routine. In each investigation, the problem was not simply individual misconduct. It was the environment that allowed misconduct to persist. Guards controlled movement, access, documentation, and communication. They decided who entered cells when medical staff were called, which incidents were recorded, and how those incidents were described. That concentration of power created a closed loop. Oversight mechanisms existed in every system examined. Internal affairs units, complaint procedures, inspection boards, use of force guidelines. But these safeguards relied heavily on cooperation from the very people they were meant to monitor. When staff closed ranks, oversight became ineffective. Silence was the most consistent feature. In Baltimore, guards stayed quiet to protect smuggling networks. In New York, officers coordinated reports to justify violence. In London, professionalism masked abuse through administrative restraint. In Romania, intimidation ensured compliance. Different methods, same result. Whistleblowers faced consequences everywhere. Those who spoke out risked isolation, stalled careers, or personal danger. The message was implicit but powerful. Loyalty mattered more than truth. Institutions rewarded stability, not accountability. Inmates occupied the weakest position in this system. Their complaints were dismissed as unreliable. Their injuries were explained away. Their voices were filtered through layers of authority. Even when evidence existed, it often took years and external pressure for action to follow. What these cases exposed was a fundamental imbalance. Prisons are designed to control people who lack power. When those in control are not themselves controlled, abuse becomes structurally possible. Reforms were announced in every case. Policy changes, training programs, new reporting standards. But investigations repeatedly found that procedural fixes did not automatically change culture. Rules could be rewritten, forms could be updated, but attitudes persisted. True accountability required external pressure, federal investigations, international monitoring bodies, media exposure, lawsuits. Without these forces, internal systems rarely corrected themselves. The most dangerous aspect of prison corruption is its invisibility. Walls block public view. Security justifies secrecy. Daily routines normalize misconduct. Over time, abuse blends into operations. These stories are not warnings of what might happen. They are records of what already has. They demonstrate that prisons do not fail loudly. They fail quietly, through habits, assumptions, and unchecked authority. The question raised by every investigation is the same. Who watches the watchers? And what happens when the answer is no one? Until oversight becomes independent, transparent, and enforced, the pattern will repeat. Different uniforms, different countries, same outcome. Power, when left alone, does not regulate itself.